Hi there, I'm William, and I'm both an archivist and video game nerd. I wanted to make this video to briefly discuss my thoughts about video game preservation. Specifically, why has preservation of video games as a medium been so slow to progress relative to other widely loved forms of media, such as film, music, the written word, and visual arts? It's no secret that video game history and preservation drags behind other forms of art. This was the case when video games first started gaining the attention of the public, and while nowadays there are established efforts to properly take care of this history, such organizations can feel few and far between, and in some cases, preserving this important knowledge and art falls to the hobbyist, taking initiative for the love of video games, but in many cases only being able to manage so much on their own. But why is this? Why do video games lag so far behind other forms of media when they've been a part of pop culture for at least 50 years? The answer is a bit nuanced, and in truth, no singular attempt to answer this question will be able to encapsulate all the various nuances that have gotten us to this point. With that in mind, this is just the perspective of one person, and if you're interested in the topic, I encourage you to both weigh in the comments as well as conduct independent research. This also serves as my blanket disclaimer: never utilize just one source for research, and never hold up a source's word as law. I'm a guy on the internet, not a peer-reviewed journal publication. With all that said, in my mind, there are three primary reasons as to why video game preservation has proven slow and/or challenging relative to other forms of media. For a too long didn't read version, these reasons are: number one, video games weren't and still aren't built to last. Number two, for a long time, the established art world refused to recognize video games as air quotes, real art. And number three, developers and publishers are hesitant to ever surrender intellectual property, especially code, to any other institution, even an intellectual one, for fear of a loss of theoretical profit. I'm going to cover all three of these topics more in depth, but I'd like to start with point one, as in my mind, it's the issue that has been the most present, the earliest in the history of gaming. From their inception, games were never really designed to stand the test of time. Now, in fairness, you could maybe make that claim about any piece of media, but I'd argue especially so with games. I think this is owed in part to the constant innovation we see within the games industry. Gaming consoles are reinvented so frequently, we refer to them as generations. This is further accentuated by the fact that there are different companies all vying to have the most profitable and beloved console of each generation. This constant innovation is not a bad thing, but it does present some problems from the perspective of preservation. While they take on different forms, both of these issues play into the larger problem of trying to create standardized hardware that can either preserve or emulate games for the purpose of preservation. Brief side note on emulation. This video is not advocating for piracy or illegal use of emulators for the purpose of playing games. Emulators are used within a different context for education in library and archive settings, and they're not used exclusively for games. There's a lot more that could be said about the topic of emulation in academia and archives, but for now, we just need to understand that emulation can be used as a means of preservation. Back on the main point of standardization, competition creates a need for hardware manufacturers to move quickly and to keep their development tools proprietary. This means, on the one hand, usually, but not always, backwards compatibility isn't a consideration when designing a new console. They want to sell new games for the new console, not just a console alone. On the other hand, the tools a repository might need to preserve a Nintendo Switch game could look drastically different from the ones they need to preserve an Xbox One game. The innovation that is a hallmark of games development has led to another issue in terms of preservation. Albeit in this instance, the problem is that, by nature of the game's capabilities, it can never be fully preserved. This statement is a little vague, so let me try to give a couple of examples. Consider Generation 2 and 3 Pokemon games, specifically their save batteries. Generation 2 especially, the batteries are notorious for having held up poorly, to the point that now many original Gen 2 cartridges cannot hold a save. While the game is, in theory, still playable, the only realistic way to complete the game is to plug it into a Game Boy SP, the only console that can take a Game Boy Color game and run off of a charging port rather than batteries. While still possible, such an experience is very limiting. By contrast, Generation 3 carts may have a better chance to save, but hopefully you weren't interested in using features that require the in-game clock function, because more often than not, that part of the battery is done for nowadays. This problem isn't just apparent in older games, however. We need only look to my favorite series, Fire Emblem. 3 of the last 4 games released have all had features that only work when the game is connected to Nintendo's Wi-Fi network. Now this wouldn't be a problem, except that these servers aren't maintained forever. In effect, someday, all of these games will have features that will be completely defunct and inaccessible. While the earliest inhibitors to preservation were an issue of games not being developed with longevity in mind, the second prominent problem came not from within the game industry, but rather the art world, and in conjunction, museums and other repositories. Back in the 70s and 80s, video games weren't considered to be a high form of art. Much the opposite, they were considered to be juvenile, or in some extreme cases, problematic. I'm sure it's nothing new to most gamers hearing about parent groups decrying video games as leading children towards real-world violence. I'm not a scientist, and as such, I don't want to get deep in the weeds on studies that have been done to test this claim, but I will say broadly, such studies have found this claim to be unfounded. For one thing, not all games are violent, and painting with such a broad brush is a bad idea. Additionally, not all people who play violent games are violent in real life. In fact, those who are violent in real life are in the minority, and not everyone who perpetrates violence plays video games. It should go without saying, but violence predates Pong. However, such notions really came to a head in the 90s, when a series of lawsuit and press coverage would result in the founding of the ESRB, America's Game Rating System. I'm not going to take shots at the ESRB. I think a rating system is a good idea. But I would like to point out a couple of games which fed into the fear that resulted in the ESRB, those games being Night Trap and Doom. Starting with Night Trap, the game was a full-motion video game, the premise of which saw the player becoming a secret agent to protect a group of girls at a slumber party from ninja vampires. Sound a bit goofy and cartoonish? It is. Night Trap was accused of being overtly sexualized, which I guess that one is subjective. These accusations were pinned on a specific scene, which features one of the girls in a pajama dress either being taken by the ninja vampires or saved, depending on player action. In the instance where she's taken, she's carted off by the arm, a method of attack which is not only consistent with the rest of the game, but also highlights how the attack is not played up for sexuality beyond the actor wearing sleepwear with cleavage. Like I said, this one is subjective, and while we in the modern day might consider it tame, in the 90s, this scene caused enough of an uproar to bring it before Congress. Moving on to Doom, the premise is simple. Shoot the aliens, save the day. Doom features pixel blood and violence, this is true. However, such violence is best considered in context. Shooting aliens while traversing a plethora of distinctly fantastical settings that don't closely resemble Earth? I'm not saying it can't lead to someone having real-life violent tendencies. I'm more so suggesting that such a connection in the brain, from step A to step B, would probably require further external and internal input, and not solely Doom. Whether or not it was right to use Night Trap and Doom as scapegoats, by the time we got there, the damage was already done for years to come. Video games were considered juvenile, perverse, and decidedly not artistic in nature. Nowadays, thankfully, more and more people have come to realize that, like any other form of media, games are not monolithic in their intent and presentation. Sure, we have sexual games and violent games, but we also have educational games and games where the artistic interpretation is the point. At the end of the day, though, games preservation was stalled by many who would have had the capabilities to preserve them, feeling as though they didn't deserve to be remembered. The third and final factor I'd like to discuss today is intellectual property, which in some ways is the most straightforward to understand. Game development studios and publishers are businesses, and businesses of competition. They want to maximize their profits while also safeguarding their secrets from those who might try to squeeze them out of the market. As such, games and development materials related to those games are kept under close lock and key, lest someone else profit off of them. This presents a distinct challenge for archives and other repositories. Normally, when we ingest something, we take over legal ownership of that item. Under most circumstances, this isn't really a problem. It's a lot harder to dispute legal ownership over a piece of paper, and most people aren't trying to continually profit from that paper. In the case of something like a movie, we can own an important copy of said movie, either a first edition or an individual copy that may have relational value. That is, value that exists beyond what's literally on the film itself. For an example of this, Think of a baseball signed by Babe Ruth. Sure, he hit a lot of baseballs, and those baseballs on their own may have value. But one that he hit and then later signed would be of particular importance relative to the other baseballs. This sort of process could in theory work for a video game, but video games tend to be comprised of more moving parts than a film. Preservation is never just holding on to something for the future, it's ensuring it's accessible and usable in the future as well. Be it a film or a video game, preservationists have to ensure the media still works. In a film's case, this is sort of binary. A film will either play or it won't. With a game, this becomes more complicated. A game could work in parts, but fail to function in other parts. In order to properly preserve a game, the argument could be made you need someone who is able to work within the code of the game to restore glitches and breaks back to the state in which the game was first taken in. Herein lies the real problem. Most game developers are very wary of the idea of letting someone outside of their organization develop a familiarity with their code. They worry that those people could go on to create their own works or re-release their original work for profit. This point, in order to move past it, requires a building up of trust between game developers and archivists. We need to be able to show that our intent is not to profit, but instead to educate. We want to ensure that these games are around as long as possible, informing new generations of historians, hobbyists, and designers. Doing so won't be easy and will require time, but the end result is well worth the effort. Preservation of video games is a worthwhile goal, but in order to do so effectively and as quickly as it needs to be done, it's important to take a moment to step back and understand how we got to this point so we can begin to move forward in a meaningful way. I'd also like to highlight a couple of ways in which you as an individual can get involved in the process. Please note that I am in no way affiliated with any of these organizations. I'm simply highlighting them because I believe in their missions. With that said, I would like to point out the National Video Game Museum in Frisco, Texas, as well as the Video Game History Foundation, who, if you can, please consider donating to. Both of whom are doing good work towards forging important industry relationships, preserving history, and advocating for the needs of preservation. I'll link both of their websites in the description. Keep in mind, there are also smaller operations around the country and around the world, and it's always good to support small businesses. That's all I really have to say today about video game preservation. Thanks for sticking with me, and I hope you found something interesting to take away from it. If you liked this video, consider subscribing. I'd really appreciate it. Have a nice day.